Hello, my name's Loretta Livingstone, and this short story is one I wrote especially for Remembrance Day. It's called A Greater Love. November the 8th, 1918. Davy Snow lay in the wreckage of mud and blood that was no man's land as the guns whumped about him. Funny the noise was so muted now, when only 10 minutes ago he'd been wishing it would stop, his head aching with the din. He opened his eyes cautiously. Acrid smoke and ash stung them, but he could see at least. He thought he'd just wait for a few more minutes while the world that spun around him righted itself. He ought to crawl away. He must. And what of his mates, Gasper and Shorty? He opened his mouth but couldn't seem to speak beyond a grunt. This was no good. He must get up. His face was beginning to hurt, and he moved his right arm to wipe away the grit and dust. Or at least, he tried. But he couldn't seem to lift it. Was he injured? But there was almost no pain, so he couldn't be. Could he? He moved his neck just an inch to take a look. A bright flash lit the sky, and his world went black. November the 11th, 1924. The shadows of late afternoon pooled around her as Alice Snow knelt before the grave of her husband, arranging golden and red chrysanthemums in the flower holder she'd insisted form part of the monument. She wiped away the tears that would still spring to her eyes despite her best efforts, and stood up, resting her hand on the headstone. I still miss you, my love. I'll always miss you. Do you know that? Wherever you are, and I hope it's not here. I hope you know that. She stepped back to admire the effect of the flowers. His favourite colours. Davy would have liked them. He loved nature. Wherever he was, did he still get joy from watching the skies change? The melting of one season into another? So hard to believe he was gone, even after all these years. When she spoke to him, she felt as though he could still hear her. Was that how it should be, or was she just over the edge of madness? No matter. She lived alone now, and if it comforted her to pretend he was still there, what business was it of anyone else? A cough came from behind her, and a gravelly voice spoke. She span around to see a man, or a parody of a man. Skin pulled tight across his face, nose almost gone, lips nothing but a dark gash in the ruined face, one sleeve hanging empty. And she gave a small involuntary scream before she had chance to stop herself. I'm sorry.
Nay, I apologise, lass. I shouldn't have bothered you. I'll go.
She could just about understand his words, but only just, slurred as they were. She reached out to touch his hand, but drew back when she realised most of his fingers were missing. No, I'm sorry. She must mask her revulsion. It wasn't his fault, poor soul. There were plenty like him these days. It could have been her Davy had he lived, and for the first time she thanked God he hadn't. He'd have hated to be like that. You just made me jump, that's all. I didn't know anyone else was here.
Nay, lass, I know what I look like. I should have known better than to scare you.
He turned to leave, and she made herself touch his shoulder, gently in case she startled him. Please, stay. Did you know him, my husband? They never said how he died.
Aye, lass, I knew him. He were a good bloke. I were in his regiment, thou knows. I went over the top with him. He never knew what hit him. 1 minute he were there, next he'd gone.
She bit back a sob.
He talked about you, you know. Talked about you all the time. Made you seem so real, the rest of us felt we knew you too. He loved you. We used to sit around and worry about our wives when we weren't fighting, him and me. Worry about how you'd cope if... or worse, how you'd cope if we ended up like I've done. Davy said he'd rather be dead.
He coughed again, a rasping, dry sound, like stones rattling against each other. Took out a flask from his pocket and drank deeply.
I'd offer you some, but...
Oh, no, thank you. I'm all right. She couldn't have put her lips to where his ravaged ones had been. She just couldn't, but not for worlds would she let him know that.
I'm glad to have seen thee, lass. He'd have wanted you to be well, to have moved on. He'd have wanted you to remember him fondly, but not to grieve him. Move on and make a life for yourself.
Alice blew her nose on the wisp of linen she found in her pocket, but her tears couldn't be blinked back much longer. She backed away, shaking her head slightly. It's so lovely to have met you, Mr.
Just call me Whitey, lass.
Whitey. Yes, well, it's lovely to have met you. So nice to have met someone who knew my Davy. The words sounded shockingly inadequate, but she was too shaken to be more polite. But I really must be going. I must go. Toodaloo. Maybe I'll see you again. She was gabbling, she knew it. She turned quickly and almost stumbled in her haste to get away, righted herself, then walked as quickly as she could through the ever-darkening shadows of the cemetery. New white headstones turning grey in the gathering gloom. Yews looming like caretakers of the dead. She left without once looking back. Next time she'd come in the morning, not late afternoon. Whitey watched her as she left, a yearning in his heart. He loved her so, missed her so, but he'd done the right thing. Now he'd met her, he was sure of it. She could barely look at him, hadn't recognised him, as he knew she wouldn't. When he'd come round a second time, still in no man's land, he'd been more aware of his horrific injuries and managed to pull his dog tags from his neck, burying them in the soft mud at arm's length from himself before they got to him. They must have been found and put with another bloke nearby, then or later. The body in this grave wasn't Davy Snow. Whitey, as he was known to his mates, Snow White if they were being particularly annoying. But it had freed her from being shackled to him, being his nurse. He gave the grave a sketchy salute.
So long, mate.
And he limped away. And before I go, I must thank members of the Author's Physician Facebook group for giving me some medical advice which helped a lot. My name is Loretta. This story is called A Greater Love. Thank you for listening.